Picture a family at dinner, a wooden table, a clay pot over a fire, the smell of pine resin and wood smoke. Outside the window, if there is a window, there is nothing. No road, no village, no light from any human settlement in any direction for more than 200 miles. The year is 1978. The family has not spoken to another human being since 1936. They do not know that the Second World War happened. They do not know that a man has walked on the moon. They do not know that the Soviet Union, the government that drove them into the Siberian wilderness 42 years ago, has launched satellites into space, built an arsenal of weapons capable of destroying the world, and is currently operating a geologic survey team 3 miles from their front door. That survey team is about to find them. What happens next is one of the most extraordinary human stories of the 20th century. A story of isolation, survival, faith, and a family who chose the wilderness over the world and paid a price that none of them could have foreseen. This is the story of the Lykov family, the Siberian Seven. If you want to hear the full declassified story of the family who disappeared into the Siberian taiga and survived for 42 years completely alone, hit that like button and subscribe to History Unclassified. To understand how a family ends up 200 miles from the nearest human being in the Siberian wilderness, you need to understand what Russia looked like in the 1930s. Karp Lykov is a member of a religious group called the Old Believers. The Old Believers are a branch of the Russian Orthodox Church that refused to accept reforms introduced in the 17th century. They have been persecuted by the Russian state, first under the Tsars, then under the Soviets, for more than 200 years. Under Stalin's Soviet government in the 1930s, practicing religion is not simply discouraged, it is actively, systematically suppressed. Churches are closed, religious leaders are arrested, communities are broken up, and their members sent to labor camps or executed. For Karp Lykov, the moment of decision comes in 1936. A Soviet patrol kills his brother in front of him. Karp takes his wife Akulina, their 2 young children, a son, Savin, and a daughter, Natalia, and walks into the forest. He does not stop walking until the Soviet Union is behind him. The family moves deeper into the taiga year by year. Each time they hear reports of other people nearby, they move further in. By the late 1930s, they are in the Abakan River region of the Khakassia district of Siberia. By the 1940s, they are further still. 2 more children are born in the wilderness. Dmitri in 1940, Agafia in 1944. Dmitri and Agafia have never seen another human being outside their own family. They have never seen a road. They have never seen a town. They have never heard a radio. They have never seen an electric light. Their world is approximately 6 acres of cleared forest, a log cabin, a root cellar, and the wilderness in every direction for further than any of them can walk in a week. Their calendar is the Orthodox calendar, maintained by Karp with the precision of a man whose faith is the only structure holding his world together. Their language is a form of Russian that has been cut off from all development since 1936. When they eventually speak to outsiders decades later, linguists will note that their speech has fossilized. They use words and constructions that Russians in the modern Soviet Union no longer recognize. Their diet for 4 decades is what they can grow in a short Siberian summer and preserve for a winter that lasts 7 months. Rye, hemp, potato, turnip, the occasional animal hunted by Dmitri on foot through the taiga without a gun. The family has a single firearm. By the 1950s, the gunpowder is exhausted and it is useless. Dmitri hunts with traps and snares. In winter, he tracks animals through snow for days, following them until they exhaust themselves, then finishing them with his hands. In 1961, the winter is so severe that every crop fails. The family survives on the bark of trees and shoes boiled into a kind of broth. Akulina, the mother, gives her share of food to her children. She dies that winter. Starvation. The family buries her and continues. They have no choice. The world outside the taiga does not exist for them. It cannot be returned to. It cannot be appealed to. There is only the forest, the seasons, and the faith that Karp insists structures every day. Morning prayers, evening prayers, the Orthodox calendar observed without exception. Fasting days kept even when there is barely enough food to survive a non-fasting day. This is their life for 42 years. And then, in the summer of 1978, a Soviet helicopter carrying a geological survey team flies over a section of the Abakan River basin that has never been formally mapped. The geologist looking out of the helicopter window sees something that should not be there. A clearing in the taiga, straight lines in the earth that do not occur in nature, the faint geometry of cultivated strips running alongside what appears to be a structure. He marks the coordinates. 3 days later, the survey team lands nearby and begins to walk in. They are not looking for people. They are looking for mineral deposits. The clearing is an anomaly, something to note in the survey log and investigate on the way past. What they find changes everything. The geological survey team is led by a man named Galina Pismenskaya. She is a professional Soviet geologist. She has worked in Siberia for years. She is not a person easily unsettled by remote terrain or difficult conditions. What she finds on the walk into the anomaly unsettles her. The first sign is a path, not an animal track. A path, worn into the earth by human feet over a long period of time, running through terrain that no human being is supposed to occupy. Then a garden, carefully tended rows of rye and hemp cut into a hillside clearing. The soil turned by hand. No tool marks consistent with any mechanical equipment. Then the smell of wood smoke. Then the cabin. It is built from logs, low to the ground, partially dug into the hillside for insulation. A single small window covered with a membrane made from flattened animal bladder, not glass. The structure is dark and close and smells of pine resin, smoke, and something older than either. Pismenskaya stops outside the door. She calls out. From inside the cabin, a voice responds. It is speaking Russian, old Russian. Careful and formal in a way that no Soviet citizen in 1978 speaks Russian. The voice belongs to an old man. His name is Karp Lykov. He is 68 years old. He has not spoken to anyone outside his family since 1936. He does not come to the door immediately. He retreats to a corner of the single-room cabin and begins to pray. He prays for a long time. His children, Seven, Natalia, Dmitri, and Agafia, cluster around him. They are watching the door with an expression Pismenskaya later describes as not quite fear and not quite curiosity, something between the two. The Soviet geologists wait outside. Eventually Karp emerges. He is thin. All of them are thin. Seven is 46. Natalia is 44. Dmitri is 38. Agafia is 34. They are all severely underweight by any medical standard. Their clothing is made entirely from hemp they have grown and woven themselves or from animal skins. Their footwear is birch bark tied with strips of hide. Seven and Natalia are visibly unwell. The decades of nutritional deficiency and the physical demands of taiga survival have aged them beyond their years in ways that are immediately apparent. Dmitri is different. He is lean and extraordinarily fit. He moves through the forest with a fluency that the geologists, experienced Siberian field workers, find remarkable. He has never worn shoes with a hard sole. He runs barefoot through snow that would stop most men. Agafia is the youngest and the most curious. She is also the most isolated. Born in 1944, she has spent every day of her 34 years in the taiga. The world the geologists come from is not simply unfamiliar to her, it is incomprehensible. The first conversation between the Lykovs and the geologists is cautious on both sides. Karp does most of the talking. He is formal and precise. He wants to know who these people are and why they are here. The geologists explain that they are surveying the region for the Soviet state. Karp's expression does not change. The Soviet state is not something Karp acknowledges as legitimate. It is the entity that killed his brother. The entity he has spent 42 years putting as much distance between himself and as geography allows. But he does not ask them to leave. Over the following days, cautious contact continues. The geologists bring food. The Lykovs accept some of it and refuse some of it. They accept bread. They refuse salt. Karp considers it sinful to accept gifts of food from strangers without certainty of their provenance. They accept a small amount of grain. They refuse meat that has been prepared by anyone outside the family. The conversations become longer, and the geologists begin to understand the scale of what they have found. This is not a family that retreated into the wilderness for a season or a year. This is a family that has been living in complete isolation since 1936, by choice, by faith, and by the logic of a man who concluded that the world outside was more dangerous than the wilderness. The geologists begin to ask careful questions about what the family knows of the outside world. The answers are extraordinary. Karp knows that a war happened. He does not know when it started or ended. He does not know who fought it or who won. He knows because, in the early 1940s, in the deep Siberian winter, he saw lights in the sky to the west that were not stars and did not behave like any natural phenomenon he knew. He concluded that something large was burning very far away. He prayed for whoever was dying. He did not know their names, their country, or their cause. He just prayed and went back to work. The family has no knowledge of the outcome of the Second World War. They have no knowledge of Stalin's death in 1953. They have no knowledge of the Korean War, the Cold War, or the existence of the United States as the Soviet Union's primary adversary. They have no knowledge of television, commercial aviation, or the internal combustion engine as a mass technology. One of the geologists, attempting to establish some common reference point, mentions that human beings have walked on the moon. Agafia looks at him for a long moment. She does not believe him. The geologists return to their base camp that evening. They have found something they cannot explain in any standard survey report. A family of 5, completely isolated for 42 years, alive, functional, maintaining a faith and a calendar and a daily routine as if the world outside has not simply changed but has never existed. The survey team leader writes a report. The report is classified. The Soviet state does not want a story about a family who chose God over the Soviet Union and survived 4 decades in the Siberian wilderness to appear in any newspaper. But someone talks. A journalist named Vasily Peskov finds out about the Lykovs in 1982. He makes the journey into the taiga. What he finds is not what the Soviet state expected him to find. It is worse. Because by the time Peskov arrives, the family of 5 is no longer a family of 5. And the reason why is going to change everything about how this story is understood. Vasily Peskov is a journalist for Komsomolskaya Pravda, the Soviet Union's most widely read newspaper. He is not an investigative reporter in the Western sense. He is a nature writer, a man who has spent his career writing about the Siberian wilderness, its landscapes, its wildlife, and the people who live on its edges. He hears about the Lykovs through the Geological Survey Network in 1982, 4 years after the initial discovery. He requests permission to visit. The Soviet authorities consider the request for a long time. They eventually agree, possibly because they calculate that a nature writer for a state newspaper is unlikely to frame the story in a way that is politically damaging. Possibly because 4 years have passed and the story has not yet leaked in any significant way, and they want to control how it eventually does. Peskov makes the journey to the Abakan River Basin in 1982. He is not prepared for what he finds. The family of 5 that the Geological Survey team discovered in 1978 is now a family of 2. In the autumn of 1981, 3 of the 4 Lykov children died within days of each other. Savin died on September 16, 1981. Natalia died on September 17th. Dmitri died on November 16th. 3 deaths in 62 days. The cause of Savin and Natalia's deaths is subsequently identified as kidney failure. Decades of nutritional deficiency combined with the physical toll of taiga survival had degraded their organs beyond recovery. The contact with the outside world, the new foods, the physical stress of interaction may have accelerated what was already inevitable. Dmitri's death is different. Dmitri dies of pneumonia. The geologists who had been working in the area had brought bacteria with them that the Lykov family had never encountered. 4 decades of complete isolation had left their immune systems with no defense against pathogens that any Soviet citizen would have been exposed to in childhood. The most physically capable member of the family, the man who hunted barefoot through Siberian snow, the man who could track an animal for 3 days and finish it with his hands. That man died of a respiratory infection that his immune system had no framework to fight. He was 41 years old. The geologist offered to evacuate Dmitri to a hospital when he first became ill. They had a radio. They could have called for a helicopter within hours. Dmitri refused. He refused not because he did not understand what was happening to him. He refused because leaving the taiga, the only world he had ever known, was not something he was willing to do. He died in the cabin where he was born. Karp buried 3 of his 4 children in 62 days. When Peskov arrives in 1982, he finds an old man and his youngest daughter living alone in the wilderness. Karp is 72. Agafia is 38. They are maintaining the same routine they have maintained for 4 decades. Morning prayers, evening prayers. The garden, the Orthodox calendar observed without exception. The dead are buried nearby. Karp visits the graves every day. He does not speak about the deaths in terms of grief in any way Peskov recognizes. He speaks about them in terms of God's will. The Lord gave and the Lord took away. This is the structure through which Karp processes everything. Peskov is a skilled observer and a careful writer. He spends extended time with the family at multiple visits over the following months. He documents what he sees with precision. What he sees is this: an old man who has built a world from nothing and watched it contract to 2 people living in a log cabin, who has lost his wife to starvation and 3 of his children to the consequences of the very contact with the outside world he spent a lifetime avoiding, who does not regret the choices that led him here, not because he is incapable of regret, but because within his framework, the old believer faith that has structured every day of his life for 7 decades, the choices he made were the only choices available to a man of conscience. The Soviet state wanted Peskov to write a story about eccentric hermits, curiosities of the Siberian wilderness. What Peskov writes is something else. His series of articles in Komsomolskaya Pravda, published under the title Lost in the Taiga, runs in 1982 and causes a reaction the Soviet authorities did not anticipate. The Soviet public responds with something close to devotion. Letters pour into the newspaper, thousands of them, from factory workers in Moscow, from collective farm workers in Ukraine, from academics in Leningrad, from pensioners across the country. The letters are not about curiosity. They are about recognition. The Lykovs represent something to the Soviet public that the Soviet public is not supposed to feel. A life organized around faith rather than the state. A family that refused the system and survived. A man who looked at what the Soviet Union offered and chose the wilderness instead. The Soviet censors watch the response carefully. They do not shut the story down. The public appetite is too large, and shutting it down would draw more attention than allowing it. But they restrict Peskov's access. They limit what he can publish about the family's religious practices. They control the narrative as much as they can. They cannot control what the Lykovs themselves say. And what the Lykovs say, in the fragments that reach the public through Peskov's careful reporting, is quietly devastating to the Soviet system's self-image. Agafia, speaking to Peskov about the outside world she is only now beginning to understand, says something that becomes one of the most quoted lines in Russian journalism of the decade. She says that she is not afraid of the world outside. She is sorry for it, She is sorry for a world that has so many people in it and still managed to produce so much suffering. This is published in Komsomolskaya Pravda in 1982, in the Soviet Union, in a state newspaper. The censors let it through. Nobody can quite explain why. The story has now reached the Soviet public. It has reached the world press, which picks it up from Soviet sources. It has reached foreign governments and foreign journalists. And it has reached the attention of the Soviet medical establishment, which now wants to assess what 4 decades of complete isolation has done to 2 human bodies. What the doctors find when they examine Karp and Agafia in 1982 defies straightforward medical categorization, and it raises a question that nobody in the Soviet medical community is quite prepared to answer. How are they still alive? The Soviet doctors who examined Karp and Agafia Lykov in 1982 are not prepared for what they find. Karp is 72 years old. He has spent 4 decades in one of the most physically demanding environments on Earth. Sub-zero winters, chronic nutritional deficiency, no medical care of any kind for 42 years. His cardiovascular health is that of a significantly younger man. His joints are worn but functional. His vision, adapted over decades to the specific light conditions of the taiga, is remarkable for his age. Agafia is 38. She is malnourished by clinical standards. Her immune system has no exposure history to the pathogens that circulate in any human population, but her physical fitness, her lung capacity, and her core strength are extraordinary. The doctors note something else. Neither of them shows any sign of the psychological deterioration that isolation studies consistently predict in long-term solitary or near-solitary confinement. No dissociation, no cognitive decline beyond what age accounts for, no signs of the anxiety or paranoia that researchers associate with prolonged separation from human society. The doctor's conclusion is careful and qualified. The Lykovs survived not despite the structure of their daily life, but because of it. The orthodox calendar, the prayer routine, the agricultural discipline, the clearly defined purpose that each day carried within the framework Karp had built. Purpose, the doctors write, appears to function as a psychological stabilizer in conditions where every other support structure is absent. This finding is classified. The Soviet state is not interested in publishing research that suggests religious practice has measurable psychological benefits. Not in 1982, not in any year of the Soviet Union's existence. The doctor's report goes into a file. The file goes into an archive. The archive is not opened for decades. What is not classified is what happens next in the taiga. The geologists who discovered the Lykovs in 1978 have continued to maintain contact. Several of them have developed a genuine relationship with the family. They visit regularly. They bring supplies, grain, tools, occasional medicine that Karp accepts or refuses based on a complex internal calculus of what is consistent with his faith and what is not. He accepts grain. He accepts hand tools. He refuses a television set offered in 1983 without discussion. A geologist named Yerofey Sedov becomes particularly close to the family. He visits the cabin dozens of times over the following years. He learns the rhythms of their life. He understands better than most outsiders what the taiga means to them. Not a prison, not a refuge in the temporary sense. Home. On February 16, 1988, Karp Lykov dies in his sleep in the cabin. He is 78 years old. Agafia finds him in the morning. She buries him beside the graves of his wife and 3 of his children. She is 44 years old. She is now completely alone in the Siberian wilderness. The Soviet authorities and the geologists who know her situation face a question they have been avoiding since the deaths of 1981. What happens to Agafia Lykov now? The answer is not what anyone expects. Agafia is offered resettlement, a flat in a nearby town, medical care, integration into Soviet society. She listens to the offer carefully. She declines. She is not staying because she does not understand what is being offered. She understands precisely. She has now had 4 years of regular contact with the outside world. She knows what towns look like. She knows what Soviet society offers. She stays because the taiga is the only world that has ever made sense to her, because her family is buried here, because the faith that has structured every day of her life demands a continuity she cannot maintain in a Soviet apartment block. She stays alone in the cabin. The geologists continue to visit. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. Agafia does not notice in any way that changes her daily life. She is still there. The Soviet Union ends on December 25, 1991. Agafia Lykov is 47 years old. She is living alone in a log cabin in the Siberian taiga, 200 miles from the nearest town, maintaining the same daily routine her father built in 1936. The political entity that drove her family into the wilderness no longer exists. It makes no practical difference to her life whatsoever. What changes after 1991 is access. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of Russia to outside journalists and researchers means that the Lykov story, which Peskov had been carefully managing within Soviet publication constraints, reaches a global audience. Peskov publishes a full account of the family's story in book form. It is translated and read internationally. The response mirrors what happened in the Soviet Union in 1982. Letters, attention, a public that finds in the Lykov story something it cannot find elsewhere. Foreign journalists make the journey to the taiga. Documentary filmmakers follow. Religious communities from the Old Believer tradition, scattered across Russia and in diaspora communities in Australia, the United States, and South America, reach out to Agafia as a figure of significance within their faith. Agafia receives all of them with the same careful, measured hospitality her father showed the first geologists in 1978. She answers questions. She shares food. She maintains her boundaries with a precision that confounds people who expect to find either a traumatized recluse or a naive innocent overwhelmed by the modern world. Agafia Lykov is neither. She is a woman who has thought carefully about the world and made a considered decision about how she wants to live in it. Over the following decades, she accepts periodic help from the Old Believer community. Several individuals come to live with her for periods of time, assisting with the physical demands of taiga survival that become harder as she ages. None of them stay permanently. In 2011, she suffers a serious illness. Russian emergency services helicopter her to a hospital in Abakan, the first time she has left the taiga in her 67 years of life. She recovers. She returns to the cabin as soon as she is able. In 2016, a wildfire burns through the area around the cabin. The Russian government airlifts her out temporarily. She returns when the fire is out. She is in her 70s. She is still there. As of the most recent verified reports, Agafia Lykov remains in the taiga. She is in her 80s. She has outlived the Soviet Union, the geologists who found her, most of the journalists who wrote about her, and the political system that made her family's isolation necessary in the first place. What does the Lykov story mean? The straightforward answer is survival. A family that developed the skills, the discipline, and the psychological framework to exist in one of the most hostile environments on Earth for 4 decades without external support of any kind. But the story resists that simple reading because the cost of that survival is not abstract. Akulina Lykov starved to death in 1961, giving her food to her children. Savin and Natalia died of organ failure at 46 and 44. Dmitry died of pneumonia at 41, killed not by the wilderness, but by contact with the world his father had fled. Karp built a world that kept his family alive and kept his faith intact. That same world cost him everyone in it except one daughter. Whether that calculus was worth it is a question that Karp answered within his own framework without apparent doubt. Whether the framework was right is a question that nobody outside it can answer for him. What is documented, verifiable, and extraordinary is simply this. In 1936, a man walked into the Siberian forest with his family because the world outside had become intolerable to him. He built a life there. He raised children there. He maintained a faith and a calendar and a daily discipline for 42 years in complete isolation. A Soviet helicopter found him in 1978 by accident. The Soviet Union that drove him into the forest is gone. The KGB that classified the first report about his family is gone. The Cold War that defined the world he rejected is over. His daughter is still in the cabin, still maintaining the calendar, still keeping the faith. The world the Lykovs rejected has changed beyond recognition in every direction. Their cabin has not moved an inch. If there are other declassified stories you think we should cover, lives that were hidden, decisions made outside the reach of governments and systems, histories that were buried and deserve to be heard, drop them in the comments below. We will see you in the next classified file.